Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 7, The Family and Delinquency. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about how family affects juvenile delinquency. And we know that experts believe that family dysfunction is definitely a key ingredient in the development of emotional deficits that can often lead to long-term social problems. So when we have good parenting, this really lowers the risk of delinquency. Of course, the family makeup is changing throughout the course of our society, and the percentage of children living with two parents varies by race and ethnic origin. We have many more single moms and teen moms, and this can often be associated with difficulties for both the mother and the child. More likely, these families are more likely to suffer from poverty and experience long-term physical, social difficulties. So with childcare being a big part of working families, we know that 49% of children ages 0 to 4 with employed mothers are primarily cared for by a relative. And 24% spend the most amount of time in a center-based arrangement. So as I'm rolling through these slides, I know they're a little bit different than what I'm telling you guys, but I wanted to just give you guys some information about family makeup, specifically to some changes that we see and just some statistics that exist. So you can see there is definitely racial differences in family makeup, regardless of what time period we are in society. This kind of goes into the specifics and details of single moms and teen moms. We know that if a child is living in a single parent home, especially one that's headed by a teenage mother, there's been long associated issues with for both the mother and the child. There are fewer teenage moms in our population today due specifically to birth control and sex education, and then, of course, the legalization of abortion. So you can see these living conditions of children by race in this graphic here, and it talks a little bit about that makeup and what that looks like for different diverse backgrounds. Yeah, I got way ahead on the slides, didn't I, you guys? So economic stress. About 7 million American youth are living in extreme poverty, and that's including substandard living conditions, inadequate health care, nutrition, or child care. And we can know that the recent political trend suggests that social safety net is really under attack with changes in political trends. So what will this economic pressure do, and will it be reduced in the future? Who knows, really? This is the recent economic upheaval, but this is in 2017 when these slides were created. So I think that it's ever changing, and politics play a huge role in that. But let's move on and get past that political standpoint and talk about some of the family's influence on delinquency. So we know that parents whose marriage is secure produce children who are secure and independent. Children that are raised in broken homes with one or both parents absent may be more prone to antisocial behavior or more behavioral problems, hyperactivity, hostility, aggression. And less than half of all children today will live continuously with their own mother or father throughout childhood. So intra-family violence is one form of family conflict that we see. And in this intra-family violence, we know that children learn at a very young age that aggression pays off. Let me see if this goes into this. Oh yeah, there's a lot that I was talking about in these slides. Sorry guys, I get ahead of myself. So definitely take some time to review what I'm talking about. with the effects of divorce on children and what we know. All right, so let's talk about family conflict. So, like I just mentioned, intrafamily conflict is a common experience in many American families. And there is some connection between this. That even was, they showed a connection in this family conflict, 50 years ago with the research that was being done at that time. So children growing up in this atmosphere of conflict who witness discord or violence, they later exhibit emotional disturbances and behavior issues. So is a family effective? And that is a big piece of it. So parents that are lacking proper parenting skills are more at risk for delinquency, have children that are more at risk for delinquency. Parents must be able to provide structure that integrates the children into the family. About 94% of parents continue to use corporal punishment in our society, and we know that from state to state, those laws about corporal punishment are different and ever changing. So, poor communications between children and parents has really been related to dysfunctional activities such as running away, homeless street youth, theft, prostitution. And if there's larger families where children can almost be lost in the shuffle, we know that there's the greater the chance of misbehavior, and that's because of resource dilution. So it's resources within that family can be minimal or less because of the number of children in that family. So when we're talking about family defiance, we know that parental defiance has a powerful impact and influence on delinquent behavior. The effects can truly be devastating in long term. Kids whose fathers are incarcerated are more likely to suffer arrest by age 25 than the offspring of conventional law-abiding parents. So really keeping it in the family is happening. So genetic factors, neurological conditions that are linked to antisocial behaviors, substance abuse. Children of drug abusing parents are more likely involved with drugs. There is a link that there is some biological basis with that. And we know that parenting skills are definitely lacking with some of these families, and deviant parents are the least likely to have close relationships with their offspring, which in turn causes further issues. So there is some stigma related to labeling, and social control agents may be quick to label children as delinquent if in fact their parents are law violators as well. So research shows that if one sibling is a delinquent, there is a significant likelihood that the brother or sister will be engaged in delinquent behavior. So they're looking at, these living in the same environments, any genetics that are determining it, and having shared interests. So be sure and read over in your textbook about these photos and this situation with this family. All right, so let's talk about child abuse and neglect. And we're going to get into this a little bit more in, I believe it's week 7, when we talk more about ACEs. But from the standpoint of what is the historical foundation of child abuse and neglect, we know that it is maltreatment of children, and it's definitely occurred throughout history. And there's been efforts to deal with this problem that did not begin until about 1874. So when we're defining abuse and neglect, we know that it's any physical or emotional trauma that has no reasonable explanation. And child abuse and neglect are often used interchangeably, those terms, but neglect refers to deprivations that children suffer when parents do not provide them. So like lack of food, shelter, health, love. And then we also know that physical neglect is parents' failure to provide adequate food, shelter, or medical care. Emotional abuse is manifested in constant criticism and rejection of the child. And emotional neglect is inadequate nurturing in attention to a child's emotional development and lack of concern. And abandonment is when parents leave their children intent to sever that relationship. And of course, sexual abuse is exploitation through rape, incest, and molestation. So there's a case of Mary Ellen, and it talks about it in the book, but it was really one of the cases that brought the United States into a position where they're starting to realize that children were being abused. In fact, there were laws to protect animals, but there weren't laws to protect children. But this case of Mary Ellen was when it really became known. There's also been some research to support this standard of battered child syndrome. We know that exists. That was back in 1962, but it's definitely an interesting research, and it is something that's important when we're looking at juvenile delinquency. So here is all of the definitions that I just went through with all of you guys, but we're going to have them on these slides as well here for you guys. I know I apologize every time I do a lecture, but the slides don't coincide very well with my notes. So this breaks it down a little bit more of the different things that can be included in physical abuse. I know that these seem far-fetched, but they do exist. And if you guys have had an opportunity to watch any documentaries about some child abuse cases, there's one, I'll have to remember the name of it, on Netflix, about a young man, I believe it was in LA County. Just really shocking what people do to their children. And this, when we talk about deliberately disfiguring a child, we talk about shaken baby syndrome. That's really huge with young children. And I think education is key for educating parents about the effects of shaking a child. So we're getting in here and reviewing some of the emotional neglect that has to do with inattention really to a child's emotional development. So lack of care and concern, possibly just lack of love is a huge piece of it. So if parents do leave children, that is abandonment, and of course, sexual abuse. So the effects of abuse are just there's just so many. I wouldn't even know where to start to limit this, but we just know that it is so devastating. And abused kids are often experiencing not only social problems, but mental health problems and substance abuse problems, real damaged personalities, because in the time when they're young and their personalities are developing, if they're being abused, it can play a major role in that development. They often can have devalued sense of self, very mistrusting of others in authority, teachers, preachers, oh, that rhymed, other important adults in their lives. They are very hostile, and they can be antagonistic to conflicts. And another thing that's really important is they lack empathy. They lack empathy for others, and they really have a diminished ability to cope. We know that specifically with sexual abuse victims, they're at a very high risk for stress and anxiety. There's many psychological deficits, PTSD, depression, eating disorders, nightmares. It just goes on and on. Suicidal issues are also a major concern. It's really impossible to estimate the extent of child abuse because the issue comes in the fact that so much child abuse is not detected. It's not reported. And so, There was a study that was done in 1980, and it estimated that between 1.4 and 1.9 million children had been abused or were being abused. And subsequent studies suggest a decline in severe violence towards children. I think parenting education is playing a huge role of that. So what are the causes of child abuse and neglect? But first, let's look at this slide that talks about who are the victims. It's interesting to look at some of the differences in the demographics of children that are abused, but we do know that boys and girls have really an equal chance of being victimized. So it's a really complex problem, and there's not a single cause or a single solution, but there are some factors that are associated with child abuse. If parents themselves suffered abuse, it can be a learned behavior. And so we know that if that's how they saw the families being, or if that's how they were raised themselves, they might have some sort of belief that that's an okay way to raise their own children. If there's an unrelated adult in the home, like a boyfriend or a girlfriend of a parent, that can often increase the chances of child abuse. And also isolated families. So families that are alienated away from other families or spend a lot of time alone can actually lead to more abuse. I think this is why we've seen increases in abuse in COVID, because we are isolating families, we're isolating children, and that can be problematic. So CPS, Child Protection System, some of their philosophies and practices. So we know that there's reasonable standards that are required for child care facilities, which keeps things hopefully on the up and up with that. And in 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment passed in Congress, the CAPTA, and that brings funds to states so they can help keep their child protection services up and going and helping with services that can be provided both to families and children. So the ways that states intervene in child abuse really varies from certain states to others, but there is an advisement hearing that's called a preliminary protective hearing or an emergency custody hearing that has to happen if a child is going to be removed from the home. And then, of course, there is pretrial conferences, and there will be a trial or a disposition. And a disposition hearing is important because the social service agency presents a case plan and recommendations for the care of the child and the treatment of the parents. And that could mean that it goes into a criminal level of child abuse where there is a criminal trial. But this is more the trial and disposition in regards to the custody of the children. It says here, research has shown no more than 10 cases out of every 100 actually reach the trial stage. And that is because, well, one of the many reasons, I believe, is because we are giving the opportunity for parents to do the right thing, to learn how to be better parents. We know that kids will always do better when they are with their own families, when they're with their parents and not in foster homes or facilities. So it's important that we're giving the parents skills to be able to have the children back into their homes. Because one of the most significant problems that is associated with abuse cases is the trauma that a child has to experience sitting up on a court stand or testifying against their own parents. Regardless of what their parents have done to them, children protect their parents. I've seen it time and time again. So that can be a very traumatic event for the child. And we know that there are different ways of getting testimony for a child. With sexual abuse cases, anatomically correct dolls are used. So those are important because children it's like play therapy. So they can basically point out maybe what something's been done to them sexually using these dolls, and that can help a judge to understand really what's happening within that home. So I want to talk to you guys about abuse, neglect, and delinquency, because that's really what we're getting at, is what is the link here? And so we're learning and I want to talk about the cycle of violence. And the cycle of violence, we often hear if we're talking about domestic abuse, there's definitely a cycle of violence that occurs. So being the target of abuse increases the likelihood of arrest as a juvenile by 59%. So if you are targeted for child abuse in your home, the likelihood that you're going to be arrested as a juvenile delinquent is 59%, increases by 59%. As an adult, by 28%, and for violent crime by 30%. This is the research, and this is pretty overwhelming and shocking. And we know that maltreated children are oftentimes much younger at their time of their first arrest. So when we're talking about this cycle of violence, we're talking about this process by which abused kids become abusers themselves. So there has to be different agencies in prevention that can help educate parents on these statistics and make better choices. And that's going to be the prevention that really plays a huge role in how we combat juvenile delinquency when we're talking about from a family standpoint. All right, there's so much more that can go into this, and I'm looking forward to having a lecture session in the next few weeks to talk more about this area of juvenile delinquency.